Now, the COVID-19 outbreak put a damper on months of protests in Lebanon, but earlier this week, hundreds took to the streets once again from Beirut to Tripoli in the north of the country. Demonstrators setting fire to banks amid a mounting currency crisis and unemployment. The country faces its most severe economic crisis in decades, which has been exacerbated by this pandemic. Now, for more on this story, I'd like to bring in our regional correspondent, Leila Molana-Allen. She joins us from the Lebanese capital, Beirut. Leila, thank you so much for being with us. We did witness very much a lull in the protest movement, but as we've seen this week, people have reached a point where they're very much defying orders, protesting, and it's been rather violent.
It has been since the beginning of this week. So since really February, the protests have hugely died down because, of course, the country was locked down. And the government seems to have done quite well in controlling the spread of COVID-19 here. But that's because they almost immediately shut down all businesses, restaurants, stopped allowing taxis, all sorts of things, which meant that they were able to stop the disease spreading, but massively exacerbated the economic crisis, which was already dogging the country. Now, this week, they announced measures to start slowly easing off over the next 6 weeks, partly because of pressure from people saying that they were on the point of starvation and poverty has escalated so rapidly over the last 2 months. And people seem to take that as a sign that it was the next stage now. The protests are back from the beginning of the week when Parliament sat for the first time since the outbreak. People spread on the streets across the country, but the main place was in Tripoli, where for the last 3 days we've seen banks being burned, lots of violence between the army and security forces and protesters out there. And just 2 days ago, a young man was shot. They were using live bullets, which has been very, very, very rare during the Beirut protests. A young man was shot and he did die. And so yesterday, people out on the streets violently protesting against the army, saying, we're out here asking for our rights, asking to be fed, asking for our government to do something for us, and you're killing our young people. Huge anger, particularly in that city.
Leila, you just mentioned protesting against the army, also targeting banks. Is it accurate to say that that's somewhat at the pivot of this particular movement this time round?
Yes, so throughout the Lebanon protest movement, the banks have been a bit of a focus, but now it really has crystallized in the last few days with them being the focus. And part of the reason for that is they're seen as complicit in the growth of this economic crisis. That's for a few reasons. The first is this dollar-lira issue. Now, for the last 22 years, the central bank has kept the lira pegged at 1,500 lira to the US dollar. What that's done is artificially held the value of the lira in a way that it really shouldn't have been. And the IMF just 8 months ago predicted that the currency was 50% overvalued, and it's deeply, deeply dived. Since the beginning of the protests, it was down to about 2,100 to the dollar in January, but over the last 2 weeks, that has slipped down to 4,000 lira to the dollar. The reason that's important is for two reasons. Firstly, Lebanon imports a lot of its goods. So because the dollar has changed so much against the lira, which is only used inside Lebanon, all the prices of anything imported have doubled. That's incredibly important. And the second reason is because many people deposit their savings in dollars, not lira, because dollars are considered to be more safe. Now, that leads me onto the second reason, which is why the banks are being considered responsible for this. Because within the banks, what they've done since the beginning of the protests, and particularly over the last few weeks, is they've restricted the money people can take out of their accounts. So if you hadn't lost your job during the previous economic crisis, you probably have in the last 2 months with the COVID closures, and you can't even access your savings because the bank's stopping you from taking them out. During that time, you are watching the value slowly drop as the value against the dollar drops. So you're losing all of your savings. And that leads me on to the third reason, which is the fact that they're not only seeing the banks as complicit with the moneyed elite classes, but in many cases, they actually are. The current finance minister is the general manager of one of the main banks in the country. The previous prime minister owned one of the other main banks in the country. And during this time, they've been stopping everyday people taking their money out. Many, many wealthy people have been secretly able to send their funds abroad. So as a result, the banks are absolutely seen as complicit with the government, with the state, in exacerbating this economic crisis and not paying attention to the poorest in society who need their help the most.
Leila Molana-Allen, they're reporting from Beirut on the economic crisis, which has drawn protesters out to the streets once again during this pandemic.